Welcome, Algebra 2 students, to solving quadratic equations by factoring. Again, an extension of what you learned yesterday. So yesterday you were solving quadratic equations, or you just factored quadratic equations. Today we're going to take it one step further and solve. Your learning target is solve quadratic equations by factoring. We're going to have, by the time we're done with this chapter, you're going to have multiple ways to solve quadratic equations. Your first way you're going to learn is factoring. So, example 1, we have x minus 6 in parentheses times 5x plus 4 in parentheses equals 0. Again, when we are solving quadratic by factoring, we always want to factor it, and we always want it to get it to equal to 0. So, once we have our term equal, or once we have our two expressions that are multiplied to each other set equal to 0, we can set them each equal to 0 and solve. Again, they can only have, we want to get them into two binomial terms. So we're going to take our first expression, which is x minus 6, and we're going to set that equal to 0. If I add 6 to both sides, x would equal 6. Then I'm going to take my second expression, which is 5x minus 4, and set that equal to 0. So if I add 4 to both sides, 5x would equal 4. This should be 5x plus 4. Hold on, let's erase all this. 5x plus 4. So I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. So 5x would equal negative 4. Divide by 5 from each side. So x would equal negative 4/5. And that would be my final answer. So negative 4/5 would be my second answer. X equals 6 would be my first answer. So example 2. Notice how this one is still set to equal to 0, which is good. But now it's not factored for us. So we're going to have to factor to start. So like we learned yesterday, you're going to take your first term times your last term. So negative 16 times 5, which is going to give you negative 80. So that's what we want to multiply to. B equals 79, so that's what we want to add to. What multiplies to negative 80 but adds to 79 are two magic numbers, so that would be 80 and negative 1. So those are our two magic numbers. So we're going to write our first term is going to stay the same, negative 16t squared. Then we're going to have our middle terms, our two magic numbers, so plus 80t and minus 1t, and the plus 5 stays the same, and that equals 0, which stays the same. So we're now going to see what we can factor out of the first two terms and the last two terms. So what can I factor out of the first two terms? Well, I can take a negative 16 out of the first two terms. If I take a negative 16 away from negative 16, actually I'm going to take a negative 16t away. So if I take a negative 16t away from negative 16t squared, I have t. And if I take negative 16t away from negative 80, that would give me minus 5. Out of the second two terms, I can take out a negative 1, which would again give me t minus 5. So again, the two terms that I factored out, which is negative 16t minus 1, that's my first expression, and the two expressions that were the same in parentheses is my second expression, which is t minus 5, and again, this is equal to 0. So I have negative 16t minus 1 times t minus 5. Now I'm going to take these, and I'm going to set both of these expressions equal to 0. So my first answer is negative 16t minus 1 equals 0. I'm going to add 1 to both sides, so negative 16t would equal 1. If I divide by negative 16, t would equal negative 1/16. Number 2, I'm going to take t minus 5 and set that equal to 0. Plus 5 to both sides, those cancel, so t would equal 5. And those would be my two answers. Example 3, 48x squared minus 15 equals negative 22x. Notice that's not set equal to 0. So I'm going to have to add 22x to both sides in order to get it set equal to 0. So when I do that, I'm going to get 48x squared plus 22x. Again, we always want to write it from our powers ascending or descending from left to right. So 48x squared plus 22x minus 15 equals 0. Now we're into our factoring portion. So we're going to take our first term times our last term. So 48 times negative 15, which is going to give us a big number, which is going to give us negative 100. It's negative 720. That's what we want to multiply to. And we want to add to our b term. So b is equal to 22. That's what we're going to add to. So we got to figure out which numbers will multiply to negative 720 but add to 22. And that would be 40 and negative 18. Hopefully you guys won't have ones this big. It'll be a little bit easier for you. That should be 40 and negative 18. 40 times negative 18 give a negative 720. 40 minus 18 gives you 22. So 48x squared stays the same. Our middle term gets replaced with our two magic numbers. So plus 40x minus 18x. And that would be minus 15 would equal 0. Do this so you can see that that is separate from what we're doing. So factor the first two terms, factor the second two terms. So what do the first two terms have in common? They both have an 8x that I can take out of them. 48 divided by 8 gives me 6. I don't know why x squared, it's just 8x. That would give me 6x. And this one would give me plus 5. Out of this term, I can take out a negative 3. If I do that, I would get 6x plus 5 equals 0. Good thing before you do to check is to make sure those two groups match. They do. So 8x and minus 3 is going to be my first expression. My second expression is going to be 6x plus 5. 6x plus 5, that came from there. Those equal 0. So now I should have two answers. I'm going to take 8x minus 3, set that equal to 0. And I'm going to take 6x plus 5 and set that equal to 0. Add 3. Add 3. So 8x would equal 3. Divide by 8. Extend the page. X would equal 3/8. Over here, subtract 5, so 6x would equal negative 5. Divide by 6, x would equal negative 5/6. And those are your two answers, 3/8 and negative 5/6. Last example, example number 4, negative 32x squared plus 56x equals 12. So again, it's not set equal to 0, so I have to subtract 12 from both sides to set it equal to 0 so we can factor. So negative 32x squared plus 56x minus 12 would equal 0. Again, you want it written standard notation with your exponents decreasing from left to right. Again, for all of these, we should have looked for greatest common factor. None of them had a greatest common factor until here. We got to here. And my greatest common factor, if I look out of all these three terms, is they have a, I'm going to factor out a -4. Because I always want to try to make this first term positive if I can. And they all have a -4. So if I take out a -4 from the first term, I'm going to have negative 8x squared. If I take a positive 8x squared, I'm just going to erase that. If I take out a -4 from 56, 56 divided by -4 will give me -14x. If I take out a -4 divided by -12 divided by -4 would give me a +3, and that would equal 0. So now I'm going to take 8 times 3, which would give me 24. That's what I want to multiply to, my first and last terms. And -14 is what I want to add to. So I try to figure out what are my two magic numbers that multiply to 24, but add to -14, and that would be -12 and -2. -12 times -2 is 24, -12 minus 2 is -14. So -4 stays the same. My 8x squared stays the same. The middle term gets replaced with my two magic numbers. So -12x minus 2x. It does not matter what order you write those in. I would have a +3, and that would equal 0. Factor out first two, factor out the second two. -4 stays the same. Extend the page. What do those two have in common? They have a 4x I can factor out. So that would give me 2x minus 3. What do these two terms have in common? They have a -1. That would give me 2x minus 3, and that's that equal to 0. Again, make sure these terms are the same so you know you did it correctly. You're going to bring down your -4, which is my greatest common factor. I had a 4x and a -1. So that goes in parentheses. And again, from here, I had a -2x minus 3, or 2x minus 3 and 2x minus 3. That goes in parentheses, and that equals 0. So this should be 2x minus 3. So again, I can set all these terms equal to 0. So first, I have -4 equals 0. Well, that doesn't work, so no need to worry about that. Secondly, I would have 4x minus 1 equals 0. So I can add 1, so 4x would equal 1, divided by 4, x would equal 1/4. And thirdly, I can take 2x minus 3 and set that equal to 0. So again, add 3, so 2x would equal 3, divided by 2, x would equal 3/2. So my two answers would be 1/4 and 3/2. So I want to go back to these ones. Notice how my highest exponent is 2. That means I should have two answers. And again, if I look, I got two answers right here. If I go here, my highest exponent was 2, which means when I factor and solve, I should have two answers, which I do. Again, highest exponent is 2. So I factor, I have two solutions because that didn't work. If you would have had -4 and you would have factored that out as, let's say we just factored this out and this the greatest common factor was an x. Well, if I set x equal to 0, that's going to be 0. If I factor out a 2x one of these times, I can set that equal to 0 again, x equals 0. So if you would have an exponent that would happen to be a 3 here as your highest exponent, that means you would have 3 solutions. If your highest exponent was a 4, that would mean you would have 4 solutions. So that is all for today. Your assignment is solving by factoring joke worksheet. Hope you guys have a fabulous weekend. Have a fabulous rest of your day. Bye.